Hello, my name is Hannah Cooper, and I am focusing on autism spectrum disorder for my brain presentation. There has been a lot of research done, there's been a lot of MRI brain scans, but there's no concrete understanding of what specific brain differences people with autism spectrum disorder have. They're simply inconclusive. There are similarities that are seen. For instance, people on the autism spectrum have deeper grooves in their gray matter. There is synapse similarities. There is larger amygdala. There are trends, but this is deemed inconclusive with actually understanding what an autism spectrum brain looks like. Autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disorder, and it can cause challenges with communication, social function, and behavior. There is no known cause of autism spectrum disorder. There are risk factors and there are trends in diagnosis, but there is no specific root of ASD. Genes are understood as a risk factor. There are trends that show the genetic transfer of ASD. Mother's lines show a higher likelihood of ASD presentation, but there is no understood genetic or chromosomal specific linkage. Also, children born to older parents are at a higher risk for being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. There are speculations on the reason for this, but there is no conclusive understanding. Autism spectrum disorder should be diagnosed and understood as early as possible. Children as young as 2 can receive diagnosis and support. A recent CDC recommendation is that if there's any missed milestones, therapies or um, therapies should begin as soon as possible. Developmental monitoring is what families can do to understand where missed milestones could happen, also what development looks like. Pediatricians can do screenings, and they should do screenings. Also, population education is really important for people who are not understanding of what autism spectrum disorder looks like. They will be less likely to talk to their pediatrician or other healthcare professionals about screening, and therefore, if a diagnosis comes, it could be a late diagnosis, which puts a child's development back. The diagnosis criteria that is used is DSM-5. This is Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and the picture shows roughly what the criteria is. Someone who is formally diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder needs to show each of these criteria in varying degrees. As I've mentioned before, autism is a spectrum, so people will show varying degrees of these different criteria, but all are represented in the person who is on the autism spectrum. It's used by professionals, but available for families to understand more about autism. Interventions, here, let me see if I can a bit easier to see. So autism interventions vary greatly. There's no cure for autism, so interventions and positive therapies are really the best thing that families can do. Interventions vary from professional support or things that families can do, like visual strategies, activity schedules, and floor time. So brain function. Several recent studies have linked synapse development and performance in MRI studies to the brains of people with autism. So the conclusions made with these new studies are that essentially the autistic brain finds it, oh, pardon me, finds it harder to switch between processes. This makes a lot of sense if you know some of the behavioral classifications of people on the autism spectrum. The above quote also shows that there is the way that people with autism spectrum develop their synapse happen later on when there are language and social development as well. So it could show us something about the way that brains develop with autism spectrum disorder. So my personal interest in ASD began when I started teaching pre-K. I became really interested in the developmental milestones and saw a lot of behaviors in students that I saw as red flags. Over the years, I've only had 4 students that were either diagnosed with ASD or I had suspected had ASD. We were unable to speak with these parents about intervention for fear of personal liability. I'm hoping to teach in a public school classroom where this is no longer a barrier to be honest and work towards goals with parents. I'm also hoping to teach either kindergarten or first grade in an inclusive classroom, which means students who are both neurodiverse and neurotypical who have varying degrees of disability are experiencing learning in the same classroom. Autism spectrum disorder in my life, these are hard to see. So my interest in autism has allowed me to understand more about my husband's family. Um, I I thought that my husband's father was just kind of a prick. The more through my education I've learned about autism, the more I understand that he is likely on the autism spectrum. In the years since I made this um, discovery, we have gained a lot more love and respect for each other. I now know how to relate to him and speak with him in a way that makes him comfortable. Um, I'm also able to support his needs. I understand his signs of irritability, and I've even helped him through meltdowns, public meltdowns. So this understanding has really brought a whole different, um, dynamic to our family. My husband's family likely has ASD on both sides. His We suspect his uncles, his and then his father on another side. We also suspect that his sister and 5-year-old nephew could be undiagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So understanding more about what it looks like in your daily life could make big changes. Something that's important to note about, pardon me, actually skipped. So something that I think is everyone needs to know is that autism is not the way that we see it in movies. There are lots of media stereotypes that show autism spectrum disorder a certain way. Even this year, a movie's coming out with highly exaggerated autism movements, and it's played by someone who's neurotypical. I personally don't think that that is a positive representation, and I think it's high time that autism is portrayed as a spectrum, as incredibly diverse, also by people who are on that spectrum. Um, Autism Speaks, this quote says, the way in which people with autism learn, think, and problem solve can range from highly skilled to severely challenged. Some people with autism spectrum disorder may require significant support in their daily lives, while others may need less support, and in some cases live entirely independently. So there's such varying degrees of autism spectrum that the media portrayal of one certain kind of autistic person is incredibly harmful. What I think is so important for everyone to know about autism is that it is so common. Estimated 1 in 54 children in the United States today is diagnosed with autism. That's very common. Early intervention is the best case scenario, and understanding that the likelihood of children being on the spectrum is high, but also knowing what the signs are. As I'm getting older and my friends are having kids, I see it as a personal opportunity to speak about ASD and talk to them about screening whenever there are missed milestones or possibilities for positive therapies. So companionship with autism spectrum is something that also has a stigma. It's a socially impacted disorder, so people with autism tend to socially have difficulties. But a recent study done last year on the communication and social landscape of autistic people found their research to highlight how neurodivergent intersubjectivity can potentially create rich social interactions. So people with autism spectrum are not necessarily unable to socially connect. It's possible that they have differences in social connection, and so people with neurodivergence see more comfort in each other than people who are neurotypical. I also included this Sesame Street clip. It's of the newest friend on Sesame Street. Her name is Julia, and she has autism. So, as you know, as young as as kids are watching Sesame Street, they can learn about their friends with autism spectrum disorder who are a bit different than them, but are fun and creative and wonderful just the same. I included all of these resources and references. Thank you very much.